Hey, what's up guys, Craze here, and today we're going to talk about Anthem, a game that, and I'm not going to lie, looks very promising both from a visual point of view as well as gameplay wise. Now, given the fact that we're getting closer to the release, there's a lot of reasons for a lot of people to get excited about. I'm excited about it. I've been waiting for this game for a very long time now, but despite all of this, there's still reasons to be cautious. That is why in today's video, I'm going to go over all of the reasons to be excited and cautious about Anthem. So I hope you guys enjoyed this. A thumbs up would be super appreciated, and let's get to it. I think I wouldn't be too far off if I said that the first thing that comes to mind when thinking about Anthem is that scene with the Iron Man looking exosuit seemingly flying across vast areas with incredible ease. In fact, that was one of the first things that we saw on the official reveal trailer that was posted like 1 year ago, and I think it's then when most people got impressed by the idea, to say the least. If there's one thing that defines Anthem, in my opinion, it has to be the freedom of movement and the fluidity of the animations. Now, I'm not sure about you guys, but I am a huge fan of games that do movement and animations right. That is the reason why I even felt in love with Marvel Spider-Man, for example. It's because of the stellar ease of movement that Insomniac Games managed to implement in it. Of course, that is a whole different experience compared to Anthem, but the point still stands, and I'd argue that after not having a proper fly and shoot game for a while now, except maybe for the Iron Man series, which was a total flop and too old to even remember, this type of gameplay remains an itch left unscratched for many, including myself. I'm glad to say that after playing the alpha in its entirety, the movement in Anthem is as good as it looks, probably even better. And to give you a general idea of how movement feels and is done in Anthem, I'm going to break it down for you right now. So in terms of flight, you can enter it in two ways. If you're on the ground, you can double press the jump button and your character will start flying towards whatever direction your camera is facing. If you're on a high point, such as for example the launch pad outside of Fort Tarsis, you can jump down and your character will enter this flight animation and even do a sort of dive bomb. Both entering and exiting these animations is done organically and blend in very well together. There's a very smooth transition between the jumping animation and the flight itself. At points, your character even does a small twirl to redirect itself depending on the starting point of the jump and the point you're flying towards. During flight, there's also several factors and animations that will influence your trajectory and the way your character moves. You can turn anywhere on the 3D axis and your character will react with a slight delay or offset to compensate for the air drag and the flight physics. It takes some time to get used to it, but you should master it within the first couple of hours, to say it honestly. This kind of movement gets used a lot in the content that exists in Anthem. It exists during puzzles and other challenging content to avoid sources of damage, for example, such as the laser rays during certain missions or strongholds. Additionally, you're given the possibility to dodge while flying with a very beautiful spin animation, which is heavily javelin dependent as it is with the movement. So you might see the Interceptor doing an over-the-top spin while in the air, while the Storm will have a sort of teleport. In fact, javelins will feel different from one another as the physics involved and the animation points are vastly different from one another, even according to a recent developer livestream. So while the Interceptor will feel, for example, like a sports car of a sort, well, except it's flying, your Ranger will feel like your regular car, and of course the tanky Colossus will feel just like that, a tanky, slow and heavy piece of metal machinery. The same goes with sprinting while on the ground, and at no point do you feel slow compared to just flying. Having your jets giving you additional speed boost when sprinting also feels very satisfying to pull off and pretty to look at. One note that I will bring in this section before moving on is that from balancing point of view, BioWare did a rather great job at implementing what is called an overheat level. In short, what this does is basically it makes it so so that the more you use your jets to fly and whatnot, they will start overheating, and that will pretty much throw you in a semi-uncontrolled descent if you happen to be up in the sky, and the animations involved in every single action that you're doing is pretty much top-notch, and everything seems to be very well synergized. Now, the second thing to be excited about is obviously the combat, which goes much more in depth than you might think. Yes, technically Anthem is a shoot and loot game, but the icing on the cake added by BioWare is the introduction of the ability combos. Basically, outside of the weapon shooting, there's two types of abilities you can use in the game in terms of damage. There's primers, which apply a debuff to the target, such as, for example, setting it on fire, poisoning it, and so on. And then there's the detonators, aka the abilities that are able to make those primer debuffs explode and not only do additional AoE damage around it, but also spread the debuffs further to nearby targets depending on the skills you choose. So a fire primed target will explode, for example, in a fiery ball upon detonating it, while a frozen target will spread ice particles and even freeze other enemies around it or slow them down. For those familiar with these kinds of mechanics, this was present as early as Mass Effect 3 and then even expanded upon in Mass Effect Andromeda as well as Dragon Age Inquisition, though it was really Mass Effect Andromeda that really went over the top with this thing. Now, I'm not here to talk about Andromeda's flaws or anything, especially since I covered it extensively last year, but if there's one thing that felt satisfying in that game, at least to me, it was the ability to set up very powerful combo detonations using this mechanic. Adding this seemingly simple concept to an online game brings in a much needed element of complexity, skill, but most of all, fun. With this kind of mechanic, not only do you have to look towards gear with powerful stats, but also at how that type of gear synergizes with your current build as well as with the skills that you're currently using, and that doesn't even take into account the fact that the skills themselves have to already synergize with one another. Now, this all might sound a bit challenging at first, especially for those unfamiliar, but once you do and you set up your own loadouts just right, you're going to be in for a lot of fun. I mean, this kind of stuff is very fun to pull off. So even though you only have 2 weapons to carry, 2 offensive abilities, 1 support ability as well as the ultimate in your arsenal at any given time, you're going to feel a fun style of combat with a refreshing twist to it. Maybe it's not going to be as extensive as an MMO, for example, where you can have dozens of abilities at any given time, but for the style of gameplay that Anthem brings, it doesn't even need to be more than that. Now, in terms of the story, and this is the third point on the list, but also the one that I'm going to talk the least about because of the amount of information that we currently have, BioWare is known for its good storytelling, and I find myself being immersed in their unique style most of the time. Anthem is planned to bring a lot of these old concepts back, which I find exciting considering that story is typically not the strong point of online games. Of course, the conflict in Anthem seems compelling and interesting so far. There's the possibility for choices to be made in the same old BioWare style, but there's also reasons for concerns, as I've said. The lack of romance is one of them. I was also hoping that since Fort Tarsus is a private lobby of sorts, we would have these options in the game, but apparently they will not be. But enough with the exciting stuff. Yes, the game looks promising, but let's not forget that this is still an EA game we're talking about, a company that, despite the heavy criticism it's facing, is still actively engaged in what many consider a scummy consumer practice. Normally, I'd say to never pre-order anything and wait for reviews, and I advise those who are still on the fence about Anthem to proceed this way. Personally, since I want to bring you the best kind of information about the game, I kinda have to get the game as early as possible, otherwise I'm pretty much going to be left behind and my advice would not be as useful. I'm not saying that I am left without a choice, actually it's far from it, but it does factor in significantly when making these kinds of decisions. Nonetheless, with all of that out of the way, luckily enough, there's 2 pieces of good news that you might be interested in. First of all, the game will give you the possibility of a free demo starting February the 1st. If you want to be cautious, you have the possibility to give it a try then, and if you want to make the purchase later on or not, then it's your decision. Second of all, in terms of microtransactions, which are probably the biggest concern nowadays, BioWare has opted for what I consider a rather consumer-friendly model, at least for now. The developers have assured everyone that these will be strictly cosmetic and no pay-to-win or loot boxes will ever make their way into the cash shop. Honestly, for now, I will treat this with a little bit of dose of skepticism, considering that the question about paid javelins has still yet to be clarified. For reference, Anthem will feature additional javelins after release, but BioWare is still not certain if these are going to be cash shop purchases or in-game rewards. While that might not be considered technically pay to win, since the game has no PvP and you're not really competing with anybody at anything, it still feels a little bit scummy to pull something like this off, considering all of the talk that has been done about Anthem and how much the developers have promised not to go the pay to win route. It's also been said that the story content and story released DLCs will be free for everybody so that the player base doesn't get split, but what about the non-story related content, like for example adding a dungeon or a raid that might end up having better loot than the average jobs in other places? Or similarly, what about areas of the map that you can unlock by purchasing them off the store with no other in-game means to do so? Technically, all of these don't really fall into the story content category, but they do have the power to influence the balance in the favor of a microtransaction riddled game. Obviously, this doesn't mean that it's going to happen this way. I'm not implying that it will. These are just a few questions that I, as well as other members of the player base, still have. And finally, the last point I want to make is about Mass Effect Andromeda, which I mentioned earlier. It's undeniable that there are a lot of similarities between these two, with Anthem obviously looking like the better game. And that's not coincidence, mind you. During Andromeda's development cycle, the teams making these games were oftentimes collaborating and even borrowing ideas from one another. It's just that the main team that worked on the Mass Effect franchise up until that point was shifted towards Anthem, while the secondary studios had to pick things off from the main series. In fact, when the gameplay trailer was first shown, the first thing that crossed my mind was in fact how Anthem appears to be like a better version of Mass Effect Andromeda and what that game should have been. I guess what I'm trying to say is that if the company was willing enough to ditch out a series that was already loved by millions for what they perceive to be a better revenue source, this can be a potential source of concern. It's this drive for more revenue instead of staying true to the values that brought them success that might ruin a potential very good experience. But for now, I am willing to judge the game for its own merit rather than assume things about it. But what do you guys think about it? Have you pre-ordered the game yet? Are you willing to do so? If so, what are your reasons? I'm looking forward to all of your replies. Also, if you've enjoyed this video, a like and a subscribe would be super appreciated, and I will see you guys in the next one. So peace out.